The moment I felt his hand grip my wrist and twist my sleeve up in front of 30 relatives, I knew this wasn't going to end with an apology. "Everyone look at this," Ryan said, holding my arm up like a trophy. "You want to know what my sister actually does? She lives off mom and dad's money and plays soldier on the weekends." The room went quiet. Somewhere behind me, a man I didn't recognize went very still, staring at the scar running down my forearm like he'd seen it somewhere before. I just smiled and pulled my arm back. My father turned 70 that Saturday, and my mother had spent 3 weeks planning the party, string lights across the backyard, a caterer from downtown, cousins flying in from 3 different states. I'd landed at Fort Campbell 2 days earlier after 9 months running logistics for a joint training rotation, and the only thing I wanted was to sit in a lawn chair with a plate of my mother's potato salad and not think about supply chains or convoy routes for 48 hours. I wore a simple blue dress, no uniform, no rank insignia, nothing that would draw a single question I didn't want to answer that day. It didn't matter. Ryan made sure the questions came anyway. My brother has always needed a stage. He's 39, 5 years older than me, and he runs the construction company our father built from nothing. Cooper Builders, the sign still says, though our father hasn't picked up a hammer in over a decade. Ryan's good at talking. He's good at making a room believe things are better than they are, which is a skill that works wonders at a birthday party and considerably less well when a bank is asking about receivables. I didn't know that part yet. Nobody did, except maybe Megan, his wife, who spent most of the afternoon watching him with an expression I couldn't quite place. He started in on me before we'd even finished the first course. "So, what's the army got you doing these days?" He asked loud enough for our Uncle Pete to hear from across the yard. I said something vague about training coordination, the kind of answer I've given 100 times to people who don't actually want the real one. Ryan laughed before I'd even finished the sentence. "Training coordination," he repeated, grinning at the table, like he'd caught me in something. "That's a nice way of saying paperwork. You know what my little sister's actual job is?" He looked around, gathering the room the way he always does, waiting until every fork stopped moving. "She sits on a base somewhere and lets the government pay her rent. Meanwhile, mom and dad still send her care packages like she's 12 years old." A few people chuckled, uncertain, the kind of laugh people give when they're not sure if it's a joke or not. My mother's face tightened. My father stared at his plate. I didn't say anything. There's a particular kind of quiet you learn to hold on to in this job. A stillness that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with knowing that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who understands what's actually happening. I've held that stillness through worse rooms than my brother's dining table. I held it now, and I reached for my water glass instead of a response. That only encouraged him. "No. Seriously," Ryan said, turning to our cousin's husband, a man named Greg, who I'd met maybe twice in my life. "She's never had a real job, not one, straight snorts out of high school into the army, and she's been letting Uncle Sam and Mom and Dad take care of her ever since. Meanwhile, I built a company from the ground up." He gestured at himself, at his watch, at the catering spread behind him, like it was evidence in a trial, only he was allowed to argue. "But sure, let's all pretend she's doing something impressive out there." Someone near the drink table asked not unkindly if I was still active duty. I nodded. Ryan cut back in before I could add anything. "Barely," he said. "She's basically on an extended vacation with a paycheck." My mother started to say something, but my father put a hand on her arm the way he does when he's decided a fight isn't worth having in front of guests. I understood that. I've made the same calculation more times than I can count, when to let a comment die in the air rather than give it the oxygen of a response. I reached for the linen napkin folded beside my plate, and as I unfolded it across my lap, my sleeve slid up an inch past my wrist. It wasn't deliberate. I don't think about the scar much anymore. It's just part of my arm, the way a scar becomes part of anyone's arm after enough years. But someone at the far end of the table noticed. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in attention. A stillness that didn't match the rest of the room's noise. I glanced over and found Daniel Brooks watching me. Ryan's oldest friend, his best man at the wedding 11 years ago. A broad-shouldered guy who'd said maybe 6 words to me all afternoon, beyond a polite hello. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my wrist, at the long pale line that ran from just below my palm toward my elbow. And something had changed behind his eyes, recognition or the beginning of it, the look of a man doing math he didn't expect to be doing at a birthday party. Ryan kept talking. Something about property values, about how people who serve get treated like heroes, for doing what he called a government job with better marketing. I stopped listening. I was watching Daniel instead, watching him set his drink down slowly on the table behind him, watching him glance once more at my arm, and then, without a word to anyone, turn and walk toward the side gate that led out to the driveway. Nobody else seemed to notice him leave. My mother was refilling drinks. My father was still holding his fork, without eating. Ryan was still talking, still building the version of me he needed the room to believe in. I didn't know yet what Daniel was about to set in motion. I only knew that for the first time all afternoon, someone in that yard had actually looked at me and seen something true. Daniel Brooks didn't walk out to the driveway to get air. He walked out there to make a phone call, and I wouldn't understand the weight of that call until much later that evening. I found out afterward what he'd been thinking in those first few minutes, standing by his truck with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen without dialing. Before Ryan's construction company, before 11 years of Sunday barbecues and fantasy football leagues, Daniel had spent 6 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd left the service the way a lot of guys do, quietly without much fanfare, trading deployments for a job managing warehouse logistics, and a life that looked from the outside entirely ordinary. But some things don't leave you just because you've left them behind. A scar like mine has a shape to it that most people never learn to read. Daniel had learned. He'd seen it on men he served beside, on friends who didn't come home the same, and once years ago secondhand in a story that had circulated through certain circles, the way stories do among people who understand what they cost. The story was about a young officer, a logistics captain at the time, who'd been riding in a convoy near a forward operating base when an IED went off under the second vehicle. Most versions of the story Daniel had heard were fragments, a name half remembered, a unit designation, the kind of detail that gets passed along at reunions and dinners until it becomes more myth than memory. But one detail had stuck with him clearly. The officer had gone back into the wreckage twice, past the point anyone would have blamed her for stopping to pull 2 soldiers out before the vehicle caught fire. She'd taken shrapnel across her forearm doing it. The name attached to that story, the one Daniel had heard repeated with a kind of reverence reserved for people who don't tell it themselves, was Audrey Cooper. He told me later that he almost convinced himself it was a coincidence. Cooper isn't an unusual name, but the scar was unusual, and the timeline was unusual, and something in the careful, unbothered way I'd sat through Ryan's insults all afternoon reminded him of men he'd known, who carried real weight and never once mentioned it at a party. So, instead of getting back in his truck, he came back inside. He found me near the kitchen helping my mother wrap the leftover cake in foil, and he asked if he could speak with me for a moment. His voice was quieter than I'd heard it all day. None of the easy backslapping tone he used with Ryan. "This is going to sound strange," he said. "But were you ever stationed at Fort Campbell around 8-9 years ago?" I told him yes. He asked if I'd served with the 101st Sustainment Brigade. Yes. Again. He asked carefully, almost like he didn't want to be right, whether I'd been part of a convoy that hit an IED outside a forward base in Regional Command East. I didn't answer right away. There are things I don't talk about, not because I'm ashamed of them, but because talking about them doesn't change what happened, and it tends to make other people uncomfortable in ways I've stopped having the patience for. But something in Daniel's face told me he wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he already knew, and he needed to hear it confirmed by the person it happened to, rather than a rumor that had traveled through years and hands until it barely resembled the truth. "Yes," I said, and that was me. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the driveway. Then he asked me 2 more questions, small details, The kind only someone who'd actually served nearby would think to ask. The call sign of the unit we'd been operating with. The approximate date. I answered both. Each answer seemed to land on him like another piece of a picture locking into place. He didn't say much after that. He thanked me, which struck me as an odd thing to say. And then he excused himself and stepped back outside. I went back to wrapping the cake, assuming that was the end of it. An old story confirmed a strange little moment of recognition between two people who'd once worn the same uniform in different corners of the world. I didn't realize Daniel had pulled out his phone again until much later. He called a friend still on active duty. Someone he'd stayed close with since leaving the Rangers. A man now working logistics coordination out of a battalion staff office. Daniel kept his voice low, standing near the fence line, where the party noise wouldn't carry. "I need you to confirm something for me," he said. "A name. Audrey Cooper. Major, I think Sustainment Brigade, formerly Fort Campbell." There was a pause on the other end, longer than Daniel expected. He told me afterward that the silence itself was strange, not confusion, but something closer to caution, like the person on the other end was deciding how much he was allowed to say over an open line. Finally, the voice came back. "Where are you right now?" Daniel gave the address without thinking much of it, still assuming this was just a formality, a way of closing the loop on a story he'd wondered about for years. "Don't go anywhere," the voice said. "Stay right there." Daniel stood by the fence for a moment after the call ended, phone still in his hand, looking back toward the house, where Ryan's laughter carried out through the open windows, where I was still inside, pretending the last 10 minutes hadn't happened at all. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but something in that voice told him it wasn't nothing. And for the first time since he'd walked into that backyard, Daniel Brooks felt like he needed to stay close and watch. Ryan had no idea anything had shifted. He was still holding court by the dessert table, recycling the same jokes about my government vacation to anyone who hadn't heard them the first time, refilling his glass, basking in the kind of attention and always mistaken for respect. I moved through the party the way I usually do at these things, present but peripheral, helping my mother keep the food trays full, answering questions with as few words as I could manage. I didn't know Daniel had made a phone call. I didn't know anyone was coming. What I noticed gradually was Daniel himself. He'd come back inside after his conversation by the fence, but he wasn't the same relaxed guy who'd been trading stories with Ryan an hour earlier. He kept checking his phone. He kept glancing toward the front of the house, toward the street, in a way that had nothing to do with the party happening around him. Twice I caught him watching me from across the yard, and both times he looked away too quickly, like a man trying not to stare at something he wasn't sure he was allowed to see yet. I've spent enough years around people under pressure to recognize the signs, even when they're trying to hide them. Daniel's shoulders had gone rigid. His jaw was set in a way that didn't match small talk at a birthday party. I almost asked him if something was wrong, but before I could, his phone buzzed again, and he stepped away from the crowd to answer it, cupping his hand around the screen, like he didn't want anyone reading it over his shoulder. I didn't hear most of that second call. I caught fragments as I passed near the side yard with a tray of empty glasses, and an address repeated back, a confirmation of some kind, a short understood. That sentence more like something you'd say to a superior officer than to a friend. Daniel's posture had changed entirely by the time he hung up. He wasn't fidgeting anymore. He was still the particular stillness of someone who has just been given instructions and is now simply waiting to carry them out. Ryan noticed it, too, eventually, though he read it completely wrong. "Hey, you good?" he called out, waving his drink toward Daniel with the easy confidence of a man who assumes every problem in the room is smaller than his own. "You've been on that phone for 20 minutes. Everything okay with the business?" Daniel looked at him for a second, too long before answering. "Everything's fine," he said. "Just handling something." "You're being weird, man," Ryan said, laughing already, turning back toward the group of cousins he'd been entertaining. "Come, get a beer. You look like you saw a ghost." Daniel didn't move toward the cooler. He stayed near the edge of the patio, instead, close enough to the driveway that I understood without being told that he was watching for something. I went back to clearing plates, telling myself it was none of my business that whatever had rattled him wasn't connected to me. Looking back now, I think some part of me already suspected otherwise. There was a way he kept glancing at my wrist, quick and involuntary, that told me this wasn't unrelated at all. My mother asked me to help carry the cake back out for a second round of coffee, and I was balancing the tray on one arm when I heard it. The low, distinct rumble of engines, pulling up outside more than one vehicle, moving with a kind of coordinated precision that civilian traffic doesn't have. My father's house sits on a quiet cul-de-sac. Cars don't usually arrive there like that. Ryan heard it too. "What's going on out there?" he asked, half amused, already assuming it was nothing more than a neighbor's landscaping crew or a delivery truck taking up too much road. He looked toward Daniel, still grinning, still certain the afternoon belonged entirely to him. "Seriously, what's with you today?" Daniel didn't answer him. He was already moving toward the front of the house. I set the tray down on the counter and followed, not because I understood what was happening, but because every instinct I'd built over more than a decade of service was telling me that something had changed in the air, the way the pressure shifts before a storm breaks. My mother followed behind me, drying her hands on a dish towel, confusion written plainly across her face. My father stood up from his chair for the first time in an hour. Ryan trailed after us, still holding his drink, still wearing the loose, unbothered smile of a man who has never once in his life had to prepare himself for a moment he didn't control. "Seriously, who's out there?" he asked again, laughing under his breath, glancing at Daniel like he expected him to be in on some joke. Daniel reached the front door first. He didn't answer Ryan. He just looked back at me once with an expression I hadn't seen on him all day. Something between apology and awe, like a man who wasn't sure if he'd just done the right thing or opened a door that couldn't be closed again. "You'll see," he said quietly, and then he opened it. Outside the driveway and the curb in front of it were no longer empty. 15 minutes had passed since that second phone call. 15 minutes, and now there was a knock at the door that hadn't come yet, but was already unmistakably on its way. 2 black SUVs sat at the curb in front of my father's house. Engines still running, government plates catching the afternoon light. A third vehicle pulled in behind them as I stepped out onto the porch, and for a moment, the entire party seemed to hold its breath in unison. 30 relatives crowding toward the windows and the front door, drinks forgotten in their hands. Ryan pushed past his own guests to get a better look, and I heard him mutter, mostly to himself, that someone must have the wrong address. It was a reasonable assumption. Nothing about our quiet cul-de-sac with its trimmed hedges and inflatable birthday balloons tied to the mailbox suggested it belonged in the same sentence as vehicles like that. The doors opened. 2 men stepped out first, both in dress uniform, both moving with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who do this often enough that urgency has been replaced by precision. I recognized the insignia before I recognized either man's face, a full colonel, and beside him a lieutenant colonel I didn't know personally, but whose bearing I understood immediately. Behind them, a third figure remained near the vehicle, clearly waiting, clearly there in a supporting role rather than a leading one. The chatter behind me died completely. My mother's hand found my father's arm. Ryan had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from a man recalculating something in real time and not liking any of the numbers. The colonel came up the front walk first, scanning the small crowd gathered at the door with the kind of practiced attention that misses nothing. His eyes found me almost immediately, and something in his expression settled like a man confirming a detail he'd already been fairly certain of. "Major Audrey Cooper," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir," I answered, stepping forward. What happened next unfolded in a way that made my chest tighten, though I kept my face as composed as I've trained myself to keep it in rooms far more difficult than this one. Both officers came to a stop in front of me and extended their hands, not the casual half handshake people give in social settings, but something with actual weight behind it. The kind of greeting reserved for people whose service means something to the person offering it. "Ma'am," the colonel said, I apologize for interrupting your family's afternoon. This couldn't wait, and given the circumstances, we felt it was better handled in person than over the phone. He handed me a sealed folder. I could feel the eyes of everyone on that porch locked onto the exchange, onto the deference in his posture, onto the folder now in my hands with a classification marking visible along the edge. "We need your signature and your input today," he said. "There's a situation developing that requires your assessment specifically. Given your background with the program, there wasn't another option." I nodded, already scanning, the first page already shifting without meaning, into the version of myself I don't often bring home. Somewhere behind me, I heard my aunt whisper something to my uncle low and startled. I heard Megan's voice quiet, asking Ryan if he'd known about any of this. I heard nothing at all from Ryan. I glanced up once, just briefly, and found the entire party frozen in a kind of stunned recalibration. The cousin who'd laughed loudest at Ryan's jokes an hour earlier was now staring at me like she was seeing a stranger standing in my clothes. Greg, who'd chuckled along about my extended vacation, had gone pale near the punch bowl. My father stood absolutely still in the doorway, his mouth slightly open, looking at me the way you look at someone you thought you already knew completely. The lieutenant colonel spoke next, addressing me with the same formal weight. "We can step somewhere private if that's easier for the family." He offered, glancing briefly past me into the house, clearly aware of the audience we'd drawn. I appreciated the offer, but there wasn't much point in pretending anymore that this could be smoothed over quietly. I asked my father if we could use his study, and he nodded, still too stunned to form words, and led the way without a single question. As I turned to follow, I caught Ryan's face for just a second. Whatever performance he'd been running all afternoon had drained completely out of him. He looked smaller, somehow standing there in his own doorway, his drink hanging forgotten in his hand, staring at the space where two military officers had just addressed his sister with more respect in 30 seconds than he'd shown her in years. I didn't say anything to him. There wasn't time, and honestly, I wasn't sure yet what I would have said if there had been. Inside the study, the colonel laid out the details of what had prompted the visit, a scheduling conflict involving a logistics assessment I'd been overseeing remotely. One that had escalated faster than expected and required my signature before the end of the day, regardless of where I happened to be. It was in the end a matter of paperwork and protocol, nothing dramatic in itself. But paperwork carried by two colonels to a birthday party delivered with that particular formality said something no explanation needed to spell out. Through the study door, I could hear the party outside, slowly finding its voice again. Hushed conversations rippling through the yard, my mother's voice rising above the rest, as and failed to explain something she herself didn't fully understand yet. Whatever version of me my brother had built for that room over the years, it had just been quietly, irreversibly replaced by something closer to the truth. Signing the paperwork took less than 10 minutes. What took longer was walking back out into a party that had transformed entirely in my absence, the air thick with a kind of charged silence I'd never once experienced in my parents' backyard. The colonel and lieutenant colonel didn't leave right away. My father, still visibly shaken, insisted they at least have coffee before driving back, and to my surprise, they accepted. I think some part of him needed the extra minutes, needed proof that this wasn't some strange hallucination brought on by too much wine and an overwhelming week. We settled at the patio table, the four of us, while the rest of the party hovered at a respectful distance, close enough to listen, careful not to look like they were listening. It was the colonel who brought it up, not me. I wouldn't have volunteered it. "I imagine your family knows about Kandahar," he said, stirring his coffee, glancing at me with an expression that assumed far more than was true. When I didn't answer right away, something shifted in his face. "They don't know," he said, not quite a question this time either. My mother set her cup down carefully. "Know what?" The colonel looked at me for permission. A small nod, more out of resignation than anything else. "There's a particular exhaustion that comes from having spent years keeping something folded up small and private, only to have it unfold itself in front of you, regardless of what you wanted. he told them in the measured economical language officers use for things that matter too much for embellishment, about a convoy hit by an IED outside a forward operating base, about a logistics officer who'd gone back into a burning vehicle, not once but twice, to pull out 2 wounded soldiers before the flames made it impossible to go back a 3rd time. He mentioned the scar on my arm, without dramatizing it, the way you'd mention any documented detail in an official account. He mentioned a commendation that had been awarded afterward, when I'd accepted quietly without a ceremony, without telling anyone beyond my direct chain of command. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father sat completely still, his coffee cooling untouched in front of him, staring at me like he was trying to reconcile the daughter he'd raised with the version of events now sitting across the table from him. Daniel, standing a few feet back near the edge of the patio, nodded slowly through the whole account, confirming with his silence that this matched exactly what he'd pieced together hours earlier from nothing more than a scar and a half-remembered story. "Why?" my mother finally asked, her voice thin. "Why would you never tell us any of this?" I thought about that question for a moment before answering, because it deserved a real answer rather than a deflection. "Because it wasn't a story to me," I said. "It was just the job. And because the 2 soldiers I pulled out that day didn't get to go home and tell their families anything. One of them still can't walk without help. I never felt like it was something to be proud of in front of people. It just felt like something I had to live with." The patio had gone entirely silent by then, the rest of the party listening openly now, no longer pretending otherwise. I could see my aunt's eyes glistening. I could see Greg staring at the ground, clearly replaying his earlier laughter in his head. I could see Megan watching Ryan, waiting for some reaction that hadn't come yet. Ryan, for his part, was standing near the sliding door, with his arms crossed. And I watched something stubborn settle over his features, the particular expression he gets when reality refuses to match the story he's already decided to believe. "Okay, this is a lot," he said finally, forcing a short laugh that didn't land anywhere near the way he wanted it to. "I mean, come on. 2 colonels show up at a birthday party with folders and medals talk, and everyone's supposed to just believe this whole secret hero thing." He looked around at the rest of the family, like he expected someone to back him up. Nobody did. "I'm not saying you're lying," he added, quieter now, though the words still carried an edge. "I just think maybe this is a bit much for a Saturday afternoon." The colonel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture straightened slightly, the kind of shift I recognized from years of watching him handle skepticism from far higher-ranking people than my brother. "I understand this is unexpected," he said evenly, "but I can assure you, sir, nothing about this is theater. Major Cooper's file isn't something we discuss lightly, and we wouldn't have made this drive for anything less than an operational necessity." Ryan didn't respond to that directly. He just looked at me instead, and for the first time all day, I saw something other than smugness in his expression, something closer to disbelief mixed with a flicker of unease, like a man standing on ground he'd assumed was solid, and suddenly feeling it shift beneath him. My father finally spoke, his voice rough. "All these years," he said mostly to himself, "and we had no idea." He reached over and took my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a teenager, and held it for a long moment without saying anything else. I didn't know yet how much further this was going to unravel, or how much of Ryan's certainty about who I was, and who he was by comparison, was about to come apart entirely before the afternoon was over. The colonel stayed only a little longer after that, long enough to finish his coffee and answer a few careful questions from my parents. But before he left, he said something that shifted the entire afternoon in a direction none of us saw coming. "I should mention," he said, setting his cup down and glancing briefly at Ryan, "Major Cooper's current role goes beyond her field record. She's been serving on the Technical Evaluation Board for a defense logistics modernization program for the past 2 years. Contracts, infrastructure assessments, vendor capability reviews, that kind of work." He said it plainly, the way you'd mention any other detail of someone's job, with no idea what those words would do to the man standing near the sliding door. I watched Ryan's face change in real time. It was subtle at first, a small tightening around his eyes. The particular stillness of someone doing rapid math they didn't want to be doing. I knew immediately what he was thinking, because I'd known for over a year, ever since a name had crossed my desk during a routine review cycle, and I'd recognized it instantly. Cooper Builders submitting a bid on a regional infrastructure contract, a project that would have meant everything to a company as overextended as his. I hadn't said anything to him then. I hadn't said anything to anyone, actually, because the review process is supposed to be exactly that, a process insulated from who you happen to be related to. His company's bid had come in with structural documentation that didn't hold up under technical review. Unrelated to price, unrelated to reputation, just a straightforward engineering shortfall that any evaluator would have flagged, regardless of whose name was on the paperwork. I'd recused myself from that particular file, the moment I recognized it exactly as protocol required, and passed it to a colleague instead. I never told Ryan that. I never told anyone in the family. It wasn't my story to tell, and more than that, I didn't want him to think even for a second that I'd had any hand in what happened to his bid, good or bad. But now, standing on the patio with two colonels, and half our extended family listening, the coincidence was laid bare in front of him, without any of that context attached, and I could see him assembling the worst possible version of events in his head. "Wait," he said slowly, his voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than his usual bluster. "You're telling me my sister had something to do with reviewing government contracts, the same year my company got denied on the Meridian Ridge project?" He looked at me now, and the expression on his face had shifted entirely confusion, curdling fast into something closer to accusation. "Did you do that? Did you have something to do with us losing that bid?" "No," I said, keeping my voice level, though the unfairness of the question stung more than I expected it to. "I recused myself the second I saw your company's name on the file. I never touched your bid. I never spoke to anyone about it." "That's not how the process works? And even if it were, I never would have done that to you." Ryan didn't look like he believed me, not entirely. But I also don't think he wanted to argue the point directly in front of a colonel who could presumably confirm every word I'd just said. Instead, something else in him seemed to give way, some final piece of the story he'd told himself for years finally cracking under its own weight. "So, this whole time," he said quieter now, almost to himself, "you knew exactly what was happening with the company. You knew what I was going through, and you never said a word." "What would I have said, Ryan?" I asked. And, for the first time all day, I let a little more of what I was actually feeling into my voice. "You never once asked me what I actually do. Not this year, not 5 years ago, not ever. You've spent years deciding what my life looked like, without ever checking if any of it was true. I didn't hide anything from you. You just never asked." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him open his mouth, and then close it again. The practiced confidence that usually filled every room he walked into nowhere to be found. Around us, the party had gone almost completely silent, the kind of silence that settles over people who realize they're witnessing something they shouldn't interrupt. My mother reached out and touched Ryan's arm gently the way she used to, when we were kids, and one of us had gone quiet after a fight. He pulled away, not unkindly, just instinctively, the way a person does when they need a moment alone with their own thoughts, rather than comfort from someone else. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the yard, and stood there with his back to the rest of us, staring out at nothing in particular. The colonel, sensing the moment had turned into something private, thanked my parents for the coffee, and told me quietly that he'd follow up on the paperwork through normal channels. He shook my hand again before he left, and this time he added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, Major, the Army's lucky to have officers who keep their heads down and let the work speak for itself. Not enough people left who do that." I thanked him, though the words landed strangely in the middle of everything else happening around us. As the two SUVs pulled away from the curb, I glanced over at Ryan, still standing alone at the edge of the yard, shoulders tight, staring at a version of his sister he'd apparently never once considered might exist. I didn't go to him yet. Some things need a little space, before they can be said honestly, and I could tell neither of us was ready. The party didn't really recover after that. Guests drifted out in small groups over the next hour, offering quiet, awkward goodbyes to my parents. The kind of exit people make when they've witnessed something too personal to comment on directly. By the time the last car pulled out of the driveway, the backyard looked strange in its emptiness. Folding chairs still arranged in loose circles. Half-finished plates of cake sitting out in the fading light balloons, drooping slightly against the fence. I found Ryan sitting alone on the back steps, elbows on his knees, staring at the grass like it owed him an explanation. I sat down beside him without saying anything at first. For a while, neither of us spoke. It had been a long time since we'd shared a silence that wasn't loaded with something unspoken underneath it. And this one oddly felt different. Not comfortable exactly, but honest in a way our conversations rarely were anymore. I don't even know where to start. He finally said, not looking at me. I've spent years telling people you don't do anything real. I said it so many times I actually started believing it myself. He shook his head slowly. And the whole time you were out there doing that. Saving people, getting hurt doing it. And I was standing at parties making jokes about you living off mom and dad. I let him sit with that for a moment before I answered. You don't need to relitigate every conversation we've ever had, I said. That's not why I told the colonel it was fine to talk in front of everyone. I paused, choosing the next part carefully because it mattered more to me than anything about the medals or the file or the scar. The thing that actually hurt today wasn't what you said at the party. People say careless things all the time, and I've gotten good at letting that roll off me. What hurt was realizing you've believed it for years, that you built an entire idea of who I am and never once thought to check if it was true. Ryan didn't argue. That more than anything told me how much the afternoon had actually landed on him. The old Ryan would have found some way to defend himself by now, some angle to argue that made him the reasonable one. Instead, he just sat there quiet, turning something over in his head that looked less like a rebuttal and more like the beginning of an actual reckoning. I think, he said slowly, I needed you to be the one who didn't have it figured out. It made it easier to feel okay about my own mess. If you were just coasting, then it didn't matter that the company's barely holding on, or that Megan and I have been fighting about money for a year, or that I lost that Meridian Ridge bid, and I still don't fully understand why. It was easier to make you the problem than to look at my own. He finally looked over at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there wasn't a trace of performance in his expression. I'm sorry. Not just for today, for a long time before today. I didn't offer him an easy absolution, because I didn't think that's what he actually needed from me. I appreciate you saying that, I told him, but this isn't something that gets fixed with one conversation on a back step. It's going to take longer than that for me to trust that you actually see me differently now, and not just because two colonels showed up unannounced. He nodded, accepting that which itself felt like progress. My parents came out a little while later, and my mother sat down on Ryan's other side, resting her head briefly against his shoulder before turning to me. We should have asked more questions over the years too, she said quietly. We let your brother's version of things fill up all the space in this family. That's on us as much as it's on him. My father, standing behind us with his hands in his pockets, nodded in agreement, though he didn't trust himself to say much more than that. Daniel found me by my car as I was getting ready to leave. He looked lighter than he had all afternoon, like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally set itself down. I've heard that story for years, he said. Never had a face to put with it. Kind of strange, finding out the woman from the story was standing in Ryan's backyard the whole time getting mocked over potato salad. He extended his hand and I shook it. Thank you for your service. I don't say that lightly, and I don't think you hear it enough. I just did my job. I said the same answer I always give, though this time it felt a little less like deflection, and a little more like the plain truth it actually was. I drove home as the sun dropped low over the tree line, the day settling into something quieter than it started. Ryan had a long road ahead of him if he wanted to actually change, Not just apologize once and consider the matter closed, but something had shifted today that couldn't be undone. The version of me he'd built out of assumption and convenience had finally collided with the truth, and he was going to have to live with that collision for a while, before he came out the other side of it, if he ever fully did. I thought about the 2 soldiers I'd pulled out of that convoy all those years ago, about how neither of them ever asked me to explain myself, how the people who understand real cost rarely need the story spelled out for them. Maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Respect shouldn't require proof. It shouldn't take a colonel showing up with a folder to make someone finally look at the people closest to them and wonder if they've been getting the story wrong all along. I want to know what you would have done in my shoes, sitting through all those years of being underestimated by someone who should have known better. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together. I had been home for exactly 40 minutes when I found out my mother-in-law expected me to iron her blouses. 40 minutes. I hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag, hadn't even washed the smell of a military transport plane off my skin, and already there was a piece of paper in my hands with my name on it, telling me what time breakfast would be served in my own kitchen. I stood in my living room, holding that list, and something in me went very quiet and very still. Anyone who has served knows that stillness. It is not calm. It is the moment before you decide exactly how the next battle will be won. My name is Julia Bennett. I'm 39 years old, a major in the United States Army, and I had just come home after 9 months overseas, managing logistics for a task force most people will never hear about. I'd spent those months sleeping 4 hours a night, coordinating supply lines under pressure, making decisions that mattered to real people's lives. I came home wanting exactly 2 things: a hot shower and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep in my own bed. The house was quiet when I let myself in. Ethan, my husband, was 3 weeks into a construction contract in Alaska, something about a pipeline inspection he'd been talking about for months. I hadn't expected him home, and honestly, I didn't mind. I just wanted the house to myself, just for one night to remember what it felt like to exist, without a schedule dictating my every breath. I got about as far as setting my bag down in the hallway before the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there they were. Margaret, my mother-in-law, 67 years old, dressed like she was arriving for a photograph rather than a visit, and Rachel, Ethan's younger sister, 35, freshly divorced, standing behind her with 2 enormous suitcases, and an expression that suggested she'd already decided which bedroom was hers. "We'll be staying here for a few months," Margaret said, smiling the way people smile when they've already made a decision for you and are simply informing you of it. I blinked. I hadn't even set down my keys. "I'm sorry, staying here." Margaret waved a hand like this was obvious, like I was the one being slow. Ethan said it was fine. Rachel sold her condo, and with everything she's going through, family needs to step in. She said this as though family were a debt only I was expected to pay. I looked past her at Rachel, who was already scrolling through her phone, not even pretending to be part of the conversation. "I want to be honest about something." In that moment, exhausted and still half convinced I was dreaming, I made a choice that I would spend the next several weeks reconsidering. I stepped back and let them in. I told myself it would be a few days, maybe a week at most. I told myself Ethan must have said something, some version of yes that had gotten lost in translation between 2 continents and a bad phone connection. I was wrong on both counts. The suitcases hadn't even cleared the doorway before Margaret reached into her handbag and produced a folded stack of papers, crisp and typed like she'd prepared them in advance. "Just a few house rules," she said, handing them to me with the satisfaction of someone completing a task she'd been looking forward to all day. I unfolded the pages, standing right there in my own foyer, still in my travel clothes, still smelling faintly of jet fuel. Breakfast at 6 sharp. Dinner cooked every night by me, apparently. The office door was to remain unlocked at all times, because Margaret liked to use it for her phone calls. The living room was reserved for her guests. Rachel would be using the garage for what the paper vaguely called storage and personal space. And at the bottom, underlined twice, was the line that nearly made me laugh out loud. Julia will handle laundry and ironing for the household as military life has surely prepared her for structure and discipline. Rachel actually smiled at that part. Your army, right? This should be easy for you. I didn't respond right away. I have learned in 14 years of service that silence is often the sharpest tool in the room. I folded the papers back along their creases and set them on the hallway table, like they were nothing more than junk mail. Make yourselves comfortable, I said, and I meant it, though probably not in the way Margaret took it. That night, after they'd claimed the guest room, and Rachel had spread her belongings across half the garage, I lay in my own bed, my actual bed in my actual home 9 months in the making, and I did not sleep. I opened my laptop instead. I stared at a blank document for a long moment, the cursor blinking, the house creaking with the unfamiliar weight of other people's presence. Then I started typing. I titled it Operation House Rules. I am not a woman who yells. I don't slam doors. And I don't raise my voice in front of people who are trying to provoke a reaction out of me. But I have spent my entire career learning how systems work, how structure can be built to reveal exactly who is willing to follow it and who only wanted control. Margaret had handed me a rulebook meant to put me in my place. I intended to hand it right back. At exactly 5 in the morning, my old Army PT whistle went off like a gunshot through the house. I heard Margaret's startled cry from the guest room, followed almost immediately by Rachel's shriek, the kind of sound you make when you think the house is on fire, and not when your sister-in-law is simply running a morning inspection. I was already dressed, moisture-wicking shirt, running shorts, hair pulled back tight, standing in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a whiteboard marker in the other. I'd mounted a small dry erase board on the wall the night before, right where Margaret would see it the moment she stumbled into the kitchen looking for her tea. On it, in clean block letters, was a schedule. 0500 wake up, 0520 room inspection, 0540 house cleaning assignment, 0615 breakfast. Margaret appeared in the doorway in her robe, hair still flattened on one side, fury already rising in her cheeks. Before she'd even fully processed what she was looking at, what in the world is this? I sipped my coffee. I thought everyone appreciated structure. You did leave me a very detailed list after all. This is not what I meant. Her voice had the particular sharpness of someone who has just realized a joke has been turned back on them and doesn't find it funny anymore. I only added a few things, I said, keeping my tone light, almost pleasant. I walked to the hallway table, retrieved her folded rulebook, and set it beside the whiteboard. Consider it collaborative editing. Rachel came stumbling down the stairs a moment later, wrapped in a blanket like she'd been dragged from a burning building. Is there an actual emergency? Why is there a whistle? No emergency, I said. Room inspection starts in 15 minutes. I'd recommend making the bed. She stared at me, like I'd spoken a different language. You're joking. In the army, I said, and I let just enough warmth into my voice that it would have been hard for anyone listening to accuse me of cruelty. Whoever sets the rules is expected to lead by example. I thought I'd show you both what that looks like. Margaret's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought she might actually walk out suitcase in hand, indignant enough to leave on principle. But Margaret was not a woman who abandoned a battlefield she believed she could still win. She folded her arms instead, chin lifted. This is ridiculous, Julia. We are guests in this house. You handed me a list of chores for a guest room stay that apparently has no end date, I said. I assumed that meant we were operating under house rules now. I'm simply matching the energy. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I did not scream. I did not throw anything, did not call anyone names, did not do a single thing that could be replayed later and used against me as evidence of pettiness or cruelty. Everything I did that morning was procedural, measured, the kind of discipline you can't argue with because there's nothing irrational to grab onto. Breakfast, when it came, was oatmeal and black coffee served at exactly 6:15 as promised. Margaret picked at hers like it had personally offended her. Rachel didn't touch hers at all, choosing instead to sit with her arms crossed, glaring at me over the rim of an untouched glass of orange juice. "You know," Margaret said, setting her spoon down with unnecessary precision. "Ethan is not going to be pleased when he hears about this." "I'd love for him to hear about it," I said, and I meant that more than she understood. "In fact, I'll send him the schedule myself." That seemed to catch her off guard. I watched something flicker behind her eyes, not quite doubt, but the beginning of it, a small crack in the certainty she'd walked in with. Margaret had built her entire authority in that house, on the assumption that Ethan would always instinctively side with his mother. It hadn't occurred to her yet that 9 months of deployment had changed the woman standing in front of her, that I was no longer the quiet daughter-in-law who absorbed inconvenience without comment. By the time I left for a run that morning, 0700 exactly as scheduled, I could hear Rachel complaining to Margaret in the kitchen, their voices pitched low but audible through the window screen. "She's doing this on purpose," Rachel hissed. "She's punishing us. She'll tire of it." Margaret answered, though there was less conviction in her voice than there had been the night before. "Julia has always been accommodating." I smiled to myself as I laced up my running shoes on the porch. Accommodating. That word had done a lot of work in this family, I was beginning to realize. It had let people assume that my calm was the same thing as my consent. It had let Margaret believe that 14 years of military discipline meant I would simply absorb whatever was handed to me without ever handing anything back. I ran 3 miles that morning, the same route I always took past Linda Morales' house. 2 doors down. She was out watering her garden and gave me a small wave, the kind neighbors give each other without needing conversation. I wondered briefly how much she'd overheard through the thin morning air. Voices carry easily in a quiet neighborhood. I had a feeling she'd find out everything soon enough. Everyone always does. I finished my run, with my heart rate steady and my mind clearer than it had been in months. Whatever Margaret and Rachel had planned when they showed up with 2 suitcases and a list of demands, they hadn't planned on this. They hadn't planned on a woman who had spent the better part of a decade learning that the person who controls the schedule controls the room. They still thought this was a phase. I let them think that. I didn't ask them to leave. That surprised people later when I told this story. Friends, other army wives, even Linda once she finally got the full picture. Everyone assumed the next logical step was confrontation, an ultimatum, a dramatic scene where I told Margaret and Rachel to pack their bags and go. But that was never the plan. I have spent enough of my career watching people mistake aggression for strength to know the difference. What I wanted wasn't a fight. What I wanted was for the truth of the situation to become impossible to ignore. So instead, I simply began applying the rules. Their rules. The ones Margaret had so confidently placed in my hands on the very first night. Whoever used something cleaned it. Whoever cooked someone else washed up. It sounds almost too simple to matter. But structure like that reveals character faster than any argument ever could. Rachel left her clothes scattered across the living room floor, the way she had, I imagine, left them scattered across every room she'd ever occupied, assuming without ever quite thinking about it, that someone else would deal with the mess. I gathered every piece, folded nothing, and set the pile neatly outside her bedroom door. No note, no comment, just the quiet, undeniable fact of it sitting there when she went to bed that night. Margaret's approach was different. More passive, more entitled in a way that was somehow harder to confront directly. She left her dishes in the sink after every meal, plates crusted with food, coffee mugs with rings drying into the ceramic, and simply walked away the way she must have done in her own home, for 40 years, the way a woman does when she has never once had to consider that dishes don't clean themselves. I stopped rinsing them for her. I moved her plates to a separate rack, unwashed, a small and growing monument to a habit she'd never had to examine before. It took about a week for the cracks to really show. Some daughters-in-law these days have absolutely no sense of responsibility. Margaret said one evening, loudly enough that she clearly meant for me to hear it from the next room. Her voice pitched with the particular self-righteousness of someone building a case for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. I walked into the kitchen, dish towel over one shoulder, and smiled the kind of smile that gives away nothing. In the army, I said, we call that personal accountability. She didn't have a response for that. I watched her mouth open slightly and then close again, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw something like uncertainty cross her face. Not doubt about me, not yet, but doubt about whether this arrangement was unfolding the way she'd imagined it would when she showed up on my doorstep with 2 suitcases and a list of demands. Linda noticed the shift before either Margaret or Rachel fully understood it themselves. She stopped by one afternoon under the pretense of returning a casserole dish, though I suspected the real reason was curiosity. The whole street had probably heard the whistle by now, had probably clocked the extra car in my driveway, had probably started putting together their own version of the story from fragments overheard across fence lines. "How's the house?" Linda asked, standing on my porch with her arms crossed loosely, a knowing look already settling into her expression. "Educational," I said. She laughed a short, genuine laugh, the kind that told me she already understood more than she was letting on. "Margaret giving you trouble?" "Margaret's giving herself trouble," I said. "I'm just not stopping it." Linda studied me for a moment, and something in her expression softened into respect. "You've always been too polite for your own good, Julia. Good to see you're not wasting it on people who don't deserve it." I didn't say much else, but I appreciated her for saying it. It's a strange thing coming home from deployment. You spend months surrounded by people who understand the language of discipline and consequence, and then you return to civilian life and have to relearn how to explain yourself to people who've never had to answer to anyone. Linda didn't need the explanation. She'd known me long enough, seen enough of Margaret's behavior over the years at neighborhood gatherings to understand exactly what was happening, with me spelling it out. Meanwhile, Margaret's frustration kept building in small, telling increments. She started making pointed comments about modern women and what marriage used to mean, aimed loosely enough into the air that she could deny targeting me directly if I ever called her on it. Rachel, for her part, had stopped even pretending to help around the house, retreating instead into long stretches of scrolling on her phone in the garage she'd claimed as her own personal space, occasionally emerging to complain that there was nothing to eat as though groceries appeared through some effort other than mine. I kept a mental log of all of it. Not out of pettiness, I want to be clear about that, but because I have learned in 14 years of service that patterns matter more than isolated incidents. One bad day means nothing. A consistent pattern documented and observed calmly over time tells you everything about a person's true character, and the pattern here was becoming very clear. Margaret believed this was still her son's house, and by extension hers to govern. Rachel believed that being family excused her from every basic responsibility a grown woman should carry on her own. Neither of them, in all their comments and complaints, had once considered that the woman who'd been managing military logistics on another continent might be quietly cataloging every single thing that was happening in her own home. They thought I was absorbing it. I was documenting it. Ethan called on a Thursday evening, his face pixelated on my laptop screen, the Alaskan light behind him strange and pale, even though it was well past what should have been evening back home. He looked tired in the particular way construction sites make a person tired, sunburned across the nose, a little thinner than when he'd left, his voice carrying that low, worn-out warmth I'd missed more than I let myself admit during the long stretches of deployment when I couldn't afford to miss anyone. "How's it going back there?" he asked, settling into what looked like a folding chair in some temporary trailer, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. I didn't complain. I want to be honest about that because it would have been the easy thing to do, the expected thing. Call up your husband 3 weeks into his work trip and unload every grievance you've been quietly cataloging. But that wasn't what I needed from him. I needed something more precise than sympathy. "Ethan," I said, keeping my voice even, "did you actually tell your mother she could move in here for months?" He blinked, and I watched confusion settle across his face in real time, unmistakable and unrehearsed. "Move in? No, God, no. I told her she could stay a week, maybe, while Rachel figured out her next place. That's it. A week. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, not relief, exactly, but confirmation. I'd suspected as much. Margaret was not a woman who lied outright. She was a woman who reshaped conversations after the fact, stretched a single sentence of permission into something far larger, and then defended that expanded version with total conviction, as though she'd never bent it at all. She's been here almost 3 weeks now, I said. With rules, actual written rules, Ethan, for me, in my own house. What kind of rules? I didn't launch into a speech. Instead, I did what I do best. I built the case methodically, the way I'd build a briefing for a commanding officer who needed facts, not feelings. I pulled up the photos I'd been taking quietly over the past 2 weeks and sent them through while we talked. A picture of Margaret's original handwritten list, still creased from where I'd folded it that first night. A still frame from our doorbell camera, showing Margaret ushering guests through our front door, gesturing at the house like a tour guide. Receipts from 3 separate jury runs, the totals nearly double what I usually spent for one person. A photo of the garage, Rachel's belongings spread across every surface. Boxes stacked against the tools Ethan kept meticulously organized before he left. I heard him go quiet on the other end of the call. I could see him scrolling through the images on his own screen, his jaw tightening incrementally with each one, that particular stillness he gets when he's genuinely angry, but too controlled to show it right away. She had guests over. He said slowly, more to himself than to me. In our house while you were, he stopped, ran a hand down his face. Julia, I am so sorry, I had no idea it had gotten this far. I know, I said, and I meant it. I have never once believed Ethan orchestrated any of this. He is in many ways a straightforward man. Steady, hard-working. Not the type to scheme or manipulate. His flaw, if you could call it that, was a lifelong habit of giving his mother benefit of the doubt, long after that doubt had stopped being earned. It's a common enough pattern in families like his. Sons who grow up believing their mother's intentions are always good, even when her actions consistently prove otherwise. I'll call her right now, he said, reaching for his phone. Don't, I said. He looked up surprised. Not yet. If you call her and yell, she'll spend the next 2 weeks performing contrition. And the second you hang up, nothing will have actually changed. I'd rather you saw it yourself. He considered that for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not doubt about me, but a recalibration of everything he thought he understood about his own household. You want me to come home? I want you to come home and see it exactly as it is, I said. Not the version your mother will describe to you over the phone. He didn't argue. That's one of the things I've always respected about Ethan. When presented with clear evidence, he doesn't retreat into defensiveness the way some people do. He looked at the pictures again, at the grocery receipts, at Rachel's boxes crowding out his tools, and something in his expression hardened into resolve. I'll wrap things up early, he said. I can be back in 4 days. Don't tell them, I said. Let it play out a little longer. I'd rather your mother show you who she is than have me tell you. He nodded slowly, and for a moment neither of us said anything, the silence stretching comfortably between 2 people who'd built a marriage on trusting each other's judgment, even from opposite sides of the world. I love you. You know that, he finally said. I mean it. Most women would have just exploded by now. I'm not most women, I said, and I let just a hint of a smile show. I'm a logistics officer. I don't explode. I plan. After we hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of my bedroom, listening to the muffled sound of Margaret's television through the wall, some evening drama playing at a volume clearly meant to announce her presence throughout the house. 4 days. I could manage 4 more days of daily inspections and unwashed dishes, and Rachel's pointed remarks about military women having no sense of humor. What I hadn't expected was how much Margaret would escalate things before Ethan ever got the chance to come home and see it for himself. Margaret decided to host a tea party on a Saturday afternoon, and she did it the way she did everything else in that house, without asking me, without so much as a courtesy heads up, simply announcing it after the fact, as though my consent had never been a variable worth considering. I came downstairs that morning to find her directing furniture like a woman, staging a home for sale. She'd pulled the good china out of the cabinet. I rarely touched the set that had belonged to my own grandmother and arranged it across the dining table with a precision that would have almost impressed me under different circumstances. Fresh flowers sat in a vase I didn't recognize. She must have bought them herself or more likely used my card to buy them, something I'd have to check later. The whole downstairs had been rearranged into a stage set for a performance I hadn't agreed to be part of. "What is all this?" I asked, standing in the doorway in my running clothes, still catching my breath from an early morning 3-miler. Margaret didn't even turn around. "Some friends from church are stopping by. I thought it would be nice to have people over." "In my house," I said without asking me. She waved a hand, the same dismissive gesture she'd used the very first night she showed up on my doorstep. "It's Ethan's house too, dear. I'm sure he wouldn't mind." I let that comment sit in the air rather than responding to it. There was something almost useful about watching Margaret build her own case against herself, brick by brick, without any help from me. I went upstairs, showered, and got dressed, not for the party, but because I had a feeling that whatever unfolded that afternoon, I wanted to be fully present for it, clear-eyed and composed. By early afternoon, the doorbell had rung several times. A handful of women filed in, all roughly Margaret's age, dressed in the kind of tasteful, coordinated outfits that suggested this was a regular social circuit for them. Margaret greeted each one at the door with theatrical warmth, gesturing them into the living room like she was welcoming guests into her own personal estate. "This is my son's house," I heard her say to one woman, gesturing broadly at the space around her, at the furniture Ethan and I had chosen together over years of careful budgeting, at the walls we'd painted ourselves the summer we bought the place. "We're just staying a little while, helping out." I stood near the kitchen doorway, a glass of iced tea in hand, and said nothing, not yet. It was one of Margaret's friends, a woman with sharp, curious eyes and an even sharper memory for social dynamics, who finally turned to me directly. "And you must be the daughter-in-law," she said, looking me over with polite interest. Julia, is it? Margaret mentioned you've been away." "Deployed," I said simply. "I got back a few weeks ago." "Well, it must be nice having family here to help you settle back in," she said, glancing toward Margaret with a small, approving smile. I could have let that comment pass. It would have been easier, certainly, to simply nod and smile, and let the afternoon continue on its rehearsed track. But I have never been particularly good at letting inaccurate things stand uncorrected, especially not in my own home. Especially not after weeks of watching someone else's version of events calcify into accepted fact. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice light, almost conversational, "the deed to this house has both my name and my husband's name on it. Margaret and Rachel have been staying with us temporarily while Rachel sorts out her living situation." A small silence settled over the room. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes went sharp and cold. "Julia," she said, a warning threaded carefully into my name. The woman who'd asked the question looked between the two of us, sensing with the particular instinct people develop for detecting family tension, that she'd stumbled into something more complicated than she'd anticipated. "I'm sorry. I just assumed. It's a common assumption," I said, still pleasant, still composed. "Margaret does tend to introduce it that way." Margaret's face flushed, the color rising fast up her neck. "That's not fair," she said, her voice tightening. "I have done nothing but try to help this family." Rachel, who'd been hovering near the refreshment table, suddenly stepped in, her voice sharp with the particular defensiveness of someone who'd been waiting for an excuse to say something cutting. "You could at least pretend to be grateful. Mom gave up her own routine to come help you out." "Help me with what exactly?" I asked. And for the first time that afternoon, I let a small edge slip into my voice. "The rule book, the 5 a.m. house rules I wrote for myself and my own laundry." The room had gone almost completely silent now. Several of Margaret's friends, exchanging uncomfortable glances, clearly recalculating whatever version of this family they'd walked in believing. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, something sharp already forming. when the sound of tires on gravel cut through the tension outside. I turned toward the window. A black SUV had pulled into the driveway, engine cutting off, and a moment later the driver's door opened. Ethan stepped out. He wasn't due back for another 2 days. He hadn't called ahead. He stood there for a moment, in the driveway duffel bag slung over one shoulder, looking at the collection of unfamiliar cars parked along the curb, and I watched his expression shift from mild curiosity into something far more focused as he walked toward the front door. Margaret's face had gone pale. Rachel had stopped talking entirely. I set my glass of iced tea down on the counter, and for the first time in weeks I let myself smile without holding anything back. I think Margaret genuinely believed, right up until the moment Ethan walked through that door, that he would take her side. That belief had probably carried her through every uncomfortable interaction of the past 3 weeks, the certainty buried so deep it didn't even register as a choice anymore. That blood would always outweigh whatever inconvenience she caused. It's a particular kind of confidence that some parents carry their whole lives, the assumption that a son's loyalty is a fixed, unshakable thing, immune to evidence. She didn't know Ethan had already seen the doorbell camera footage. She didn't know about the grocery receipts, the photos of her rulebook, the pictures of Rachel's boxes crowding out 3 weeks' worth of his tools. She had no idea, standing there in her tasteful floral dress with her book club friends, frozen mid-conversation around her, that her son had spent the last 4 days quietly wrapping up a job in Alaska, specifically so he could come home and witness this for himself. Ethan didn't raise his voice when he walked in. That surprised his mother more than anything else, I think. She'd probably braced herself for an argument, something loud and messy she could counter with tears or indignation. Instead, he set his duffel bag down by the door, looked slowly around the transformed living room, at the good china, at the unfamiliar guests, at his mother standing in the middle of it, all like she owned the place, and he asked one simple question. "Mom, who gave you permission to hand Julia a list of house rules?" The room had gone completely silent. Margaret's friends were doing that particular thing people do when they realize they've walked into a private family matter, studying their teacups, glancing toward the door, calculating the most graceful moment to leave. "I was only trying to help her adjust," Margaret said, her voice climbing slightly defensive. "She's been away so long, Ethan. Someone needed to bring some order back into this house." "This is Julia's house," Ethan said, and something in his tone, quiet, level, absolutely unmovable, carried more weight than shouting ever could have. "Our house? Not a house that needs your rules, while she's the one who's actually lived here, paid for it, maintained it while I was gone, and while she was deployed." "I raised you in this family," Margaret said, and I could hear something genuine cracking through her composure now, something closer to real hurt than performance. "I don't understand why you're speaking to me like this." "Because I saw the camera footage," Ethan said. "I saw you letting strangers into our home and telling them it was yours. I saw the grocery bills. I saw what you did to my tools in the garage." He turned to Rachel, who had gone very still by the refreshment table. "You need to pack your things, both of you, today." Margaret's composure finally broke. Tears rose fast, and she pressed a hand to her chest like the words had physically struck her. "Julia is tearing this family apart," she said, her voice cracking. "You're choosing her over your own mother." I stood near the kitchen doorway through all of this, and I want to be honest, I didn't say a single word. I didn't need to. I had spent 3 weeks documenting, structuring, letting the pattern speak for itself, and now I watched as it did exactly that. In front of an audience Margaret had invited herself in front of witnesses she couldn't later dismiss as biased or exaggerating. Ethan didn't take the bait. "I'm not choosing anyone over anyone," he said, his voice steady even as his mother's tears intensified. "I'm asking you to respect boundaries in a house that isn't yours. That's not the same thing as abandoning you." Rachel finally spoke, her voice sharp with the particular anger of someone who knows they've lost, but isn't ready to admit it. "This is ridiculous. We're your family. And Julia is my wife," Ethan said simply. "That doesn't put her below you on some kind of list, Rachel." It never did. Margaret's friends had begun quietly gathering their things, murmuring polite, awkward goodbyes, the kind of exit people make. When they've witnessed something, they'll be discussing amongst themselves for weeks afterward. I walked them to the door myself, thanked them for coming with a warmth I mostly meant, and closed it gently behind the last one, leaving the four of us alone in a house that suddenly felt very quiet. What happened next surprised me more than anything else that day. Ethan didn't ask Margaret and Rachel to pack. He simply walked upstairs himself into the guest room and began gathering their belongings with quiet, methodical efficiency, folding Margaret's clothes into her suitcase, boxing up the toiletries scattered across the bathroom counter, carrying Rachel's things out of the garage box by box, stacking them neatly by the front door. I didn't help him, and he didn't ask me to. This wasn't my fight to finish. I had done my part simply by living honestly in my own home for 3 weeks and letting the truth accumulate on its own. This part, the part where a son finally drew a line his mother had spent years, assuming didn't exist, belonged to Ethan alone. Margaret cried the entire time, alternating between pleading with her son and shooting me looks across the room that I met without flinching, without softening, without offering the apology she seemed to be waiting for. I had nothing to apologize for, and some part of her, beneath the tears, must have known that too. By early evening, both suitcases sat by the front door again, exactly where they'd started 3 weeks earlier, except now Ethan carried them out to Margaret's car himself, his jaw set, his movements calm and unhurried. Rachel followed behind him, silent for once, glancing back at the house one last time before climbing into the passenger seat. I stood on the porch beside Ethan as the car pulled out of the driveway, Margaret's face pale and stricken behind the windshield. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it," Ethan said quietly, watching the taillights disappear down the street. "You saw it in time," I said. "That's what matters." He put his arm around me, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the house behind us felt entirely, completely our own again. Margaret called almost every day for the first 2 weeks after she left. I let most of those calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I understood something she didn't yet, that whatever came next between us needed to happen on honest footing, not out of guilt or pressure or the particular urgency people manufacture when they're trying to undo consequences, rather than actually understand them. When I did pick up, I stayed polite, measured. I never once raised my voice at her, never once said anything I'd regret later. I had learned long ago that dignity is worth more than the temporary satisfaction of saying something cutting. It wasn't losing the house that finally changed her, though. I want to be clear about that, because I think it says something important about what actually shifts people. It wasn't the confrontation, wasn't the tea party unraveling in front of her friends, wasn't even Ethan's quiet, methodical packing of her suitcase. What changed Margaret happened almost 2 months later, when Ethan sat his mother and sister down separately and told them calmly that he would no longer be covering Rachel's rent, or her car payment, or the credit card bills that had apparently been quietly accumulating under his name for longer than either of us had realized. Rachel had been leaning on her brother financially for years. It turned out long before her divorce, long before she showed up on our doorstep with 2 suitcases and an attitude. Margaret had known about it the entire time and had said nothing, had instead spent her energy managing the optics of the family rather than addressing the actual dysfunction underneath it. When Ethan finally drew that line, not out of anger, but out of the same steady clarity he'd shown the day he packed their bags, something in both of them finally cracked open in a way that mattered. Margaret called me directly one evening in September, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, none of the performance left in it. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not because I lost somewhere to stay, because I spent so long believing that being someone's mother gave me the right to control everything around him, including his marriage." I didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. I let her sit in it, let the weight of that admission exist between us, without softening it prematurely. "Thank you for saying that," I finally said. "It means something. We didn't fix everything in that one phone call. Real repair doesn't work that way, and I've never believed in stories that pretend otherwise." But a few weeks later, I invited Margaret and Rachel over for dinner. Not a tea party staged for an audience. Not a performance for anyone's benefit. Just a quiet Sunday meal in the house that had caused so much friction between us. This time things were different in ways I noticed immediately. Small shifts that told me more than any apology could. Margaret carried her own dishes into the kitchen, without being asked, rinsing them herself before setting them in the rack. Rachel cleared the table without complaint, folding napkins with an attentiveness I'd never once seen from her during the week she'd lived under my roof. Nobody handed anybody a list. Nobody assumed anything about whose house this really was. Later that evening, after the dishes were done, and Ethan had stepped outside to check on something in the garage, I opened the kitchen drawer where I'd kept it all along. Margaret's original rulebook still folded along the same creases from that very first night, the paper slightly softened now from months of sitting untouched. I set it on the table in front of her. Margaret looked at it for a long moment, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Embarrassment, maybe. Or the particular discomfort of confronting an old version of yourself you're not proud of anymore. I picked the paper back up, and without any dramatic flourish, without any speech, I tore it cleanly in half. In this house, I said, setting the torn pages down, there's only one rule that actually matters. Margaret looked up at me, waiting. Respect, I said simply, for each other. That's it. That's the whole list. Nobody said anything for a moment. Margaret's eyes were bright, and Rachel, sitting beside her, reached over and quietly took her mother's hand, a small gesture, but one I hadn't seen between them in all the weeks they'd stayed with us. Ethan came back in from the garage just then, glanced at the torn paper on the table, at his mother's face, at mine, and didn't ask what he'd missed. He just sat down and reached for the pot of coffee I'd left warming on the stove. And for the first time since Margaret had shown up on our doorstep with 2 suitcases, the 4 of us sat together at that table like an actual family, imperfect, still healing, but honest with each other in a way we hadn't been before. I think about that a lot, even now. How the loudest battles in a family are rarely won through anger. How discipline, patience, and quiet documentation of the truth can accomplish what shouting never could. I didn't set out to punish Margaret or Rachel. I simply refused to let someone else's version of my own life stand uncorrected in my own home. Sometimes, that's all it takes. Not revenge, not cruelty, just the steady, patient insistence on being treated the way you deserve to be treated, and the willingness to hold that line until the people around you finally see it too. I still keep half of that torn rulebook in a drawer somewhere. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe as a reminder of who I almost let myself become that first exhausted night home from deployment, a woman too tired to defend her own house. Or maybe just as proof that sometimes the people who try hardest to control you are the ones who end up teaching you exactly how strong your own quiet can be. I'd love to know what you think this story says about family boundaries and what it really means to stand your ground without ever raising your voice. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. It always means so much to hear from you. We've got so many more stories like this one coming your way, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a moment. Let's keep this journey going together.